Welcome to Talking Precision Medicine, the podcast in which we discuss the future of healthcare and health technology, and how advances in data and data science are fueling the next industrial revolution. This episode features Jason Springs, co-founder and CEO of Endpoint Health, an ascendant precision therapeutics company. Jason is a serial entrepreneur who, with the co-founders of his previous company, is building Endpoint Health to bring together under one roof the data science, diagnostics, and therapeutics necessary to achieve truly personalized healthcare. Come in and have a listen.
Welcome, everybody, to another edition of Talking Precision Medicine. It's my distinct pleasure to introduce and welcome our guest, Jason Springs. Jason is co-founder and CEO of Endpoint Health, a really interesting, innovative precision medicine company. I'm going to let Jason do the talking, though, and tell us what Endpoint Health is all about.
Perfect. Thank you for the chance to share a story, Raphael. So Endpoint Health. I think the best way to think about us is we are a precision therapeutics company. And what that means to us is really we're trying to create what we think is the future state of what therapeutic companies or maybe even healthcare companies in general should be, which is developing therapies and always at the front understanding where those therapies should go, what patient populations, and building, not just developing the therapies, but developing companion diagnostics to help pick those patients out in both clinical trials and in clinical practice as a baseline. We are focused first and foremost on diseases that are driven by the immune system, mostly immune dysregulation, which is a pretty broad area that ranges all the way over in areas like COVID-19, which of course is still in everyone's mind. A lot of the sickest patients that end up in the ICU, they're there because really their immune system has had a very massive reaction to an infection. And you can always slide to the other end of the scale and look at chronic illnesses. And those range from things like rheumatoid arthritis to inflammatory bowel disease, but they all have a common origin, which is the immune system functioning in a way that really is harmful to the patient and to their own body. And that's where we think we can apply, our unique approach to really save lives where people haven't had success before and dramatically improve outcomes where picking responders out, picking the right patient out is the best way to both do development and practice clinical care.
Now, that sounds really important, and you are preaching to the choir. This is something that Jeannie Alice feels deeply about and thinks a lot about. How did you decide to do this? So, without getting ahead of myself, this is not your first company you've built, but how did you decide that precision therapeutics is where you want to focus your energy?
Yeah, it's a good question. It's a longer story than Endpoint Health. I am lucky enough to have a couple of co-founders who have been through this journey, been through the journey of building and growing a healthcare company in the past. Really, the Endpoint story starts with the first company that I built along with my co-founders, Diego Rey and Leonardo Teixeira, who serve as Endpoint Health's Chief Scientific and Chief Operating Officer. We were all in graduate school at Cornell. I was in the business school, and they were both getting their PhDs. And we met in 2007, all looking to start a healthcare company. And it was truly almost as simple as that. We met through a mutual colleague, a business school professor, and we ended up building a company called GeneWeave, which was based on actually just an idea that my co-founders had at the time. It wasn't even part of their original research, but the idea was around building really better diagnostics to identify patients with bacterial infections and kind of the transition part to Endpoint Health, figure out what the right therapy was, the right antibiotic was for those patients very quickly. And that company, we went through the classic venture capital healthcare sequence, which was we came out to the San Francisco Bay Area, which is one of a few locations where there's really ecosystems to support this, raised capital, built a company up, and built out the underlying technology, which really was a fundamentally new method of detecting and measuring information about bacteria. But over about a 5-year period, we built out not just the technology, but the actual medical product around it, hardware, wetware, software. And by 2015, we were really working on products that were looking at figuring out what was the best therapy for a patient, mostly looking at infections, And at that point, we were approached by Roche and ended up getting acquired and integrating into Roche. That was an interesting transition period because by that point, we had all really, I don't know any other way to say it, we had fallen in love with the idea of making sure that patients got the best therapy for them based on information we could see. It was a beautiful concept. And when you see how a lot of medicine works in the real world, which many of us see every day, that's far from how patients are treated on a day-to-day basis. And, we were all there at Roche for a couple of years. And at the same time we were there working on our own technology, we were watching a lot of the oncology practice at Roche, which spans both diagnostics and therapeutics. And that 2015 to 2017 window was a very interesting time period. We were deeply interested in getting the right therapy to the right patient. And at that same time, Roche, at the end of the day, ended up acquiring Flatiron Health and Foundation Medicine. Right. And of course, Genentech was also had been part of the Roche family. I think it was going on a decade at that point. And the light bulbs went off for us. I'm sure they had gone off for our colleagues in the Roche organization. Seeing those three pillars under one roof just seemed like a fantastic opportunity to change the way that drug development occurred. And if you back way up, we don't have to talk about the underlying technology, but if you think about it, you had a way to understand patients with Flatiron Health. They had access to patient data from the electronic medical record. Foundation Medicine had a very elegant solution for guiding patients to the right therapy. They have a FDA-approved companion diagnostic panel. And of course, Genentech is one of the global leaders in oncology. And in our minds, we thought, the next evolution of healthcare is going to be when those three functions are really integrated. And around that time, we basically got the bug again and said, we should make that company. And we, at different times from 2017 through 2019, the three of us left, but we ended up coming back together still on that idea of building, what the next generation of healthcare companies would look like, which really was all about from the ground up, always having data science around patient data, testing capability to find the right patient, and drug development, all coordinated and integrated together. And that was the synthesis of Endpoint Health. Where we clinically ended up focusing really was a part of our own origin. We are a company focused on immunology, where the immune system isn't functioning the right way. We actually started in the hospital looking at probably the world's, I'd say, greatest unmet medical need, which is sepsis, acute respiratory distress syndrome. And those are immune-driven illnesses. And so we started out the company looking at how do we think about these problems? How do we think about and pull apart the immune response of patients in a way that could drive a different method of drug development? And over the last few years, where we've ended up is applying the techniques we developed there to many, many, many different disease areas that are primarily driven by immune dysregulation. We just fell in love with patients and making sure they got on the right drug at the right time. And we backed out to, well, what's the type of organization that would be a leader if that was your North Star? And Endpoint Health was our answer. And it's I think a successful experiment in the running, and we're really excited for where we are.
That's a really fantastic origin story. I've got a lot of topics I want to dive deep on. I'm going to say them out loud so I don't forget them, but we can pick some place to start. So I want to hear more about the actual tech you're building, and then we'll get back to that. I guess what's so interesting to me is that you kind of observed while you were at Roche the same thing that strikes me as a problem or a challenge in making precision medicine a reality, which is the diagnostics industry and the drug industry are different industries. And in most times they don't sit in the same roof and they have very little to actually do with one another. Very often diagnostic tests are invented and there is no drug to respond to what they learn. And often drugs are developed and there's no diagnostic test to help guide them. And it's just like two very separate entities. And so your observation that you want to pull them together is, I think, astute, but then where do you start? And so the question is really, where is Endpoint Health on its journey? I know it's a young company, but maybe you could shed some light on how you as the CEO think about a strategic roadmap if you have to build both a diagnostic and a drug and all the data and the data science that goes with it, like how much are you going to do in-house? How much do you think about outsourcing? Where do you even begin?
It's a very tough and very good question. And it's something we think about a lot. And the earliest that we saw that was kind of a snapshot of this disconnect between the world of diagnostics and the world of drug development, really went back to our final days, really thinking with GeneWeave, because antibiotics, what you should have, even in the earliest days when they were first invented, the knowledge that you should figure out which one is the right one first, what was a fundamental part of using those therapies. But oftentimes a test to guide the use of those drugs isn't launched at the same time as the drug. And that's a really complicated problem. And that is simply a poster child for how much of the industry works. Everything we've done with Endpoint has certainly been purposeful. Even the name, Endpoint Health, the name is there as a reminder that the company's not about the technology. It's about that end goal of generating additional units of health benefit for the patients we serve. One of the things that we focused very hard on was picking out disease areas and methods of looking at even at data and building the company out where the technical work that we brought in-house was the type of work that really had to be done in-house. It had to be something that was unique to us. For example, the data science side, we have both clinicians that have data science training on staff, as well as data scientists that have deep understanding of biology on staff, because at the end of the day, if you're going to really make a precision medicine product, it's all about linking information together with what's really going to happen in a patient's body. That's all in-house. We have our own diagnostic staff because no matter how sophisticated your insights, if you don't really understand what your initial data means in terms of building a final physical blood test or whatever kind of test it is, if you've got at some point a real physical test has to exist in a lab somewhere, and it has to be stable and easy to use. And without that, there is no precision market, because you can't translate insights into practical clinical development trials or clinical practice. So we bring that in-house. We have therapeutic development in-house. What do we leave out? We do have a heavy partnership model. So there's two things that I think make us pretty unique compared to many of your data-driven or AI-driven drug discovery companies, or just people thinking about how to change the world that way. One is we actually partner and put our companion diagnostic test onto other people's systems. So we have a partnership with BioCardis. They have a platform that's actually used by other companies to develop their companion diagnostics. And that way we don't, we start life off as a company with a relatively robust, globally placed diagnostic system. So we can make sure that therapies could be guided to patients all over the world. On the therapeutic side, both for de-risking the company and for just serving patients as best and fast as we can, we actually skew to the side of identifying therapies that have already been developed by other biotech or pharma organizations. And, the benefit there is the way our platform works, which we can talk about a bit. If we see a population of patients that we really think might respond to a particular therapy, and that therapy is already approved, on the market, or perhaps has gone through phase 1 or into phase 2 clinical trials, what you get to do is skip way ahead. You fast forward and get a therapy into precision trials, into the clinic, into patient hands much faster, because you skip over a lot of that long and expensive drug discovery process. And so those are two areas where, from a business model standpoint, we design the company not just to understand patients, but to translate that understanding into precision therapies in the global hands of clinicians at scale in a risk mitigated and honestly much faster way than traditional. Case in point, we're heading towards filing our first IND, which will take us into our first phase 2 trial next year. We've only been around for about 3.5 years. So that's a pretty quick jump to head into that stage of clinical development. And it was all planned out. And, it's a different way of looking at it. All the different, I think, points of view are needed, but that makes us unique.
No, that's fascinating. It does make a lot of sense. There was a model in some of the early kind of AI drug discovery companies to do something similar. Now, they were not, focused inherently on a precision, like patient subtyping approach, but this idea of if our algorithms can come up with a drug, let's try to find one we can repurpose because we can certainly get the proof points in the clinic a lot faster. And that makes a ton of sense. The fact that you can actually target those to patients who are going to benefit makes even more sense. So I think it's a strategy that really has legs. So in terms of where the company is, I mean, that's a pretty amazing traction so far. Where are you in your kind of fundraising and your growth? How big are you? I'd be interested to know more about how much above your weight you're actually punching.
Yeah, that very interesting use of phrasing. It's something we talk about a lot internally. So we've been around for about 3.5 years. We had our first round of financing in 2019. That was led by the Mayfield Fund. We have some announcements that'll come out, I'd say, in the near future, but I won't preview them too much here. I'll let those let those go out. We have about 24 people full time. I need to go check. We've had a couple of new folks join just over the last couple of days, and I need to see what the roster's up to. And because we have a partnership model, there's quite a number of additional staff that we have on contract. We grew up during COVID, so not just having the number of people, but I think just who's in the company and where they are is interesting. We have people from data science background, diagnostics, therapeutics, academic background, startup background, decades of experience in the industry. And I think right now we have employees in 4 countries on 3 continents because we were able to really scale and go where the talent was, which is really interesting. I'm sure many of your guests talk about this.
Yeah, no, you're seeing my love language. This sounds a lot like our composition as well. It's highly global. And I think COVID has given us all a really good excuse to try new models of company formation and company growth. You know how some companies, they have kind of underneath their geographic locations, like a design house may say, Paris, Milan, and wherever, Paris, Milan, London. Startups, it's usually Boston, San Francisco, maybe San Diego or something. Well, this one was remote first, Toronto, Boston. And I thought that was pretty clever. Zoom, that's where we're located in Zoomville.
Yeah, I do feel like we live there.
But I want to get into your solution a bit though, and there's sort of the 2 aspects, sort of technologically, and obviously you don't have to give away the secret sauce, but sort of technologically, what do you do that's cool and unique? And then getting back to the partnership model, these are data hungry operations. So how do you think about sourcing the right data for your solution?
So from a tech standpoint, we really have 3 pillars inside the house. So we have our data science, we have diagnostics, and we have therapeutic development. And really everything that we do is enabled by the information that we look at from patients. We very much live a patient-centric data point of view. And it kind of starts with, well, what kind of information do we capture? So we primarily focus on looking at gene expression data, so whole transcriptomic data from patients that are suffering from immune-driven illnesses. And what we've developed is a proprietary machine learning platform that takes in that data and uses an unsupervised machine learning technique. And there's a really important reason for that. What we are primarily interested in is states, or distinct about the immune system. What you're really looking at is states. It's a dynamic system. And what the past has shown us is that if you look at any one individual marker, whether it's RNA or a cytokine, you really are not capturing the full resolution of the patient. You're looking at really just one mechanism moving up and down. So we have a very broad-based approach to look at these patients. And what we've ended up seeing is that when you look at all the data coming from a patient, especially in immune-driven illnesses, what you get is not just information from individual cell types, which I know is a big focus if you're looking at target discovery or drug discovery, but you also get the broader patient picture, which is really important because anytime you have a dynamic system, working in the body, you have a lot of feedback loops. And at the end of the day, a physician treats a patient. They don't treat an individual cell, although they are critically important. So the basic output of our system is that we end up seeing these immune-defined subgroups of patients. And our job after that is to look at the biological characteristics. And what we've seen so far, and you can see some of our earliest publications, relatively recent in journals like Shock, is that these subgroups of patients have pretty distinct characteristics when it comes to what functions of the immune system are upregulated or downregulated. And what we've seen is that seems to carry some weight when it comes to how patients may respond to therapies that suppress or attenuate different immune responses. And if you fast forward all the way to how does that translate into an actual clinical trial or a therapy, at the end of the day, what we're doing is identifying populations of patients that what our evidence shows us is they'll respond differently to the types of therapies that may be used to tune the immune system up or down, whether it's an anti-inflammatory or an immune stimulant. And it's our job when we translate that into products to make tests, diagnostic tests that are easy to deploy that can actually identify those patients in the real world. And we also identify which therapies seem to have signal that they'll work better in those subgroups. And we go out and identify and in-license or partner around those therapies. That's how we ended up with our very first in-license. We identified antithrombin 3 as a potential very key therapy in a subgroup of sepsis patients we could identify that seemed to have a large amount of coagulation disorder, which was triggered by immune response. And this sequence of events, understanding the patient, being able to translate that into a test that can let the physician understand who the patient is, and attaching a therapy that may be particularly beneficial to those patients is one of the powers of having all three of those pillars in-house.
Yeah, that's a great example. You said something that just kind of slipped in, but I want to highlight it. You said once you've done your machine learning, you've identified immune-defined subgroups, you look at the biology of those subgroups. And that piece is really important. I've had this conversation now 3 times today. It's like, what do you do with the black box model? And the short answer is in diagnostics, I don't think you can let it remain a black box. You have to be able to explain it.
Actually, I'm very glad you brought it up. And it's something that it's almost easy for us to forget to highlight, that the machine learning is the permission slip to go and do the hard clinical validation work. And case in point, once we've seen some subgroups, to us, that's interesting. But to be honest, it's meaningless until you look at what's going on with the rest of the patient population. Are we actually seeing differences in biology? Can we validate that those patients have different clinical features that are meaningful? And then, of course, at the end of the day, we do look, and you asked this, what is the real thing that matters? Can you actually take a look at patient data from being treated either with a therapy in the real world or in a clinical trial, and actually see that there's statistically significant differences in how those patient groups respond? Because we're not just in this business to create math, we're in this to create the capability of treating patients much better than they're treated now. And that tough slog, and it's not just the subgroups, it's making sure you can repeat that work with a well-validated in vitro diagnostic test, because you still have to deploy it globally.
So, in the case of sepsis, I'm guessing, but I could be wrong, that you're going to be working with like data that derive from blood draws or something similar. Does your partnership model then extend to hospitals, points of primary care? Are you mostly working with academic clinicians? Like, how do you think about, accessing the patient populations you need both to do the modeling, but also the validation?
I think like many companies, you've got a multi-pronged approach. So there's, of course, absolutely fantastic public data sets that are available, which I think is, a credit to NIH funded work that's happened over the decades. Other avenues that we work with, we do have partnerships with academic medical centers. We actually have a pretty large partnership in Brazil where we've done a lot of our perspective, basically created our own patient registries for longitudinal data, both capturing biologic information, but clinical outcomes as well. So that before going into a clinical trial, we really have vetted and de-risked exactly what we expect to see in terms of both data and patient statistics going into a trial. So there's a lot of different areas that we capture data, but I'd say they fall into, you can start in a lot of areas with great public data. A week in the library can save you a year in the lab. An old colleague of ours used to say that. And then, as you move forward, a lot of the work really is prospective observational studies. And then, of course, interventional trials when you get to therapeutic work. And all of it involves very deep relationship building with the clinicians that are seeing these patients every day. You can't build a new therapy without really getting the input from the clinical community at the end of the day.
And, so sepsis makes a ton of sense to me. We actually had a podcast episode a few back with another company working on sepsis from a totally different angle. It seems like a real scourge and a great place for different technologists to focus. What was the inspiration for focusing on the immune system sort of writ large? Is one of your co-founders kind of an immunologist by training, or is it just that it happens to underlie so much of what we think we know about disease?
Again, I'll go back. It honestly started with the patients. We had spent quite a long time looking at infections in hospitals, which is really about bacteria or viruses that get into the patient's body. But as we decided, let's start looking at how we could improve how sepsis patients are cared for, how clinical trials are run there, because it's an area with limited clinical success. And the lens that we were looking at those patients with was one where they were complex patients. We thought there must be a way to use much of the data that's been generated around these patients and new techniques of looking at it to solve this problem. And we went where the science led us. It led us to looking primarily at the immune system. That's where the heterogeneity really seemed to come from. We developed our platform to pull that heterogeneity apart. And then we kept asking the question, well, if this problem exists here, where else do you have the immune system heavily involved in illnesses where treatments either don't exist or where they're nowhere near as effective in all the patients that get them as any of us would like? And we just kept pulling that thread, and we saw some very beautiful patterns continue to come up over and over and over again. And I think what we're really seeing is something similar to what happened in oncology, where we're at today in the world of oncology. And I won't claim to be an expert there, but even I can see how the trial endpoints are changing and evolving, where you have mutation positive patients with a tumor of any particular origin. And what we're really starting to see is certain immune states that seem to be the same type of immune state across many, many, many different illnesses. And they may have different clinical features, but that underlying cause seems to be kind of similar. And, you've actually seen this before. If you look in a lot of asthma and respiratory illnesses, you actually see some therapies that have been approved. I think it's eosinophilic asthma or type 2 inflammation asthma. And people are starting to see this common pattern in other respiratory driven illnesses. So I think we're really at the front of a huge transformation in how just diseases involving the immune system are treated. And so we're excited to push that forward. But it all just came back to asking, what can we do to help some patients we really care about that didn't have options? And you back out from there.
Yeah. The patient heterogeneity piece is really interesting to me too. I mean, this is why probably most drugs don't succeed in clinical trials and why they don't even necessarily work in the real world, right? Because people are so damn different.
It's funny, a lot of my personal perspective on the world, case in point for what you're mentioning, I look at a lot of illnesses and I always think back to growing up. My mother's a type 1 diabetic. So very early in life, I thought all healthcare really was about taking a blood test, measuring something, and then taking, for her, insulin, only if you got the right result. That's a very, looking back, very naive point of view. But it's a really great microcosm to look at how important precision medicine can be, because you have insulin, in fact, synthetic insulin, which was the herald of the modern biotech age coming out of Genentech and Eli Lilly, and it works. It works all the time. The question is, are you the right patient for it? Are you a type 1 diabetic or not? And at this point in time, are you in the right state to have a positive outcome from taking that therapy? And I think that's been a story for a very long time. But my guess is as we progress technically, clinically over time, we're going to see that story, where there may have been some clinical trials that failed or didn't work nearly as much as we want, or the same story in the real world. I think we're going to see, especially in these very complex illnesses, whether it's neurodegenerative, immune-driven, infectious disease, we're going to see that that's actually been the story in a lot of places the whole time. And, the goal is, well, how do you rewrite that story so that patients benefit and you build a different kind of company around it? And that's really what we're focusing on. But I'm in full belief with you.
Let's talk about building that company a little bit. I'm interested to pull on the thread a bit that you've mentioned about how diverse your team is, just in terms of the backgrounds and the expertise. How have you and your co-founders thought about prioritizing certain pieces of expertise, about recruiting, about attracting that talent? And maybe the most important thing, and I'm stealing this from my friend Tina Larson at Recursion Pharma, which is coming up with a common language that everyone can speak, right?
Oh boy, yeah. That is absolutely a critical activity to do. And it's not easy. It's something you have to recognize, that a lot of words that are very well defined in many different industries actually mean dramatically different things. One of my favorite meetings was we have our diagnostic team, and we have a therapeutic team. And when they get together and talk about technical progress, you typically have a phase 0, phase 1, phase 2, phase 3 in the diagnostic world. And that's before you get into clinical trials. And the clinical trials on the therapeutic side are phase 1, 2, 3, and phase 4. And so it's a funny way of seeing what is truly a challenge that you have to really see and take a hold of. One of the things that we do, which I'll credit, I have some fantastic senior members of our team. One of the things that we do is from the beginning, we built integrated, at Roche, they would call them life cycle teams. They're called global product teams in other areas. But the point is to make sure that from the beginning of even an idea around a product, that there's always a data science, a diagnostic, and a therapeutic representative, or sets of representatives, all present at the table talking from day one. Because the reality is there's very few, if any, companies that have decades of figuring out that common language. Almost any company really has to do it themselves. So it means you have to consciously work at it. And you have to recognize within each group, there are different sources of risk that you almost have to have this cross-functional education session about, where changing a number in one place might have an impact on how you run a trial 5 years later. And, I think the key is having a really collaborative team. They're all focused on getting the right thing for the patient. So we all start at the patient and we back out to what are all the things that need to happen, all the way down to where do we need to go and get new data, and developing that language as we go. It's worked. It is absolute work. And I think anyone in our shoes will have to do it. I should call up your former guest and see if they have tips and pointers.
Yeah, well, Recursion has certainly done a good job of scaling. It's rare to look at a sort of find another AI-driven therapeutics company that's blitz scaled the way they have. So they've done a good job. I'll give Tina a lot of credit. It also occurs to me, one of the languages that therapeutics and diagnostics folks don't always speak the same is regulatory. And I'm just curious if you can spend a minute on how much, given you guys are pretty early, but you're entering IND, how much you're leaning on regulatory expertise and kind of baking that into the roadmap.
Yeah, it came very early. The good news is, just at least from the background of the co-founders, and actually some of our team members as well, having already worked on some products. Actually, we have team members that worked in the oncology space and in the infectious disease space. So, the concept that you're developing a test or a drug and they need each other is something that we all had an appreciation for, that it can be complex and that you need to get really good guidance early on. I think guidance really comes in two ways. If you think you need a capital C companion diagnostic or complementary diagnostic, you need to interact with both CDRH. You've got to interact with the diagnostic and device part of the FDA, and you have to start interacting with the therapeutics division. So very early on, we got world-class expertise to help on both sides and made sure they were in the same room. I think 90% of the job is actually showing up in the same room and talking about this very early. The really good news, and I've spent, I think, 20 years now in regulated markets. The FDA is your friend in this. They do a lot of work to get guidance documents out, to invite you in, and pre-submission, pre-IND meetings, to have these conversations early. So I would say for all the listeners, read the guidance documents, interact with the FDA early and often. That is their job, is to get safe and effective therapies out, just like yours is. And it's something that we're leaning heavily on as well. But you got to start early, way before you're in the clinic.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think that's an excellent point. And I think you can sometimes read between the lines when you hear about a biotech that maybe didn't succeed in their clinical strategy. They probably showed up too late or were overly antagonistic. And I've found, maybe as a bit of a surprise, all of my interactions with the FDA have been absolute delightful interactions. Not necessarily every meeting is hugs and kisses, but like they really are there to be on your team, right? Like we're all on the same side. And through the Alliance for AI in Healthcare, which is an organization I'm involved in, we've really pushed hard to engage with the FDA on putting out guidance specifically around how to treat machine learning models, as they are going to be playing a much bigger role going forward. I think especially in diagnostics, but probably up and down the drug development food chain.
I think it'll be everywhere, and that's great. I mean, it's needed. There's a hunger for it, and you can even see, there's pre-guidance documents that have come out, on the subject. We know that there was a before, and we're in the after. Looking at how novel ways of analyzing data. It's here to stay. It's embedded in how development programs will work, and the question is, how do we do it in a safe way and do it at scale, as you mentioned.
Yeah. Maybe a little bit of a shift of gear, but I'm still interested in the kind of company building. Since you and your co-founders are now serial entrepreneurs and have had some success in your prior enterprise, I think some amount of our listenership are people more like me who are still in their first companies and trying to navigate some of the waters. As I like to joke, you have to make every mistake at least 3 times before you learn the right way to do it, even if there's a book out there to tell you the right way to do it first. Maybe you can just share top of mind some of the kind of lessons learned. Maybe a success story, but also a failure story. If you've got one of those, it always helps to make the rest of us feel not so alone in the world.
Plenty of both. And, I think some of the biggest takeaways that, we got from our last company and even confirmed as we've been working in Endpoint, especially when you're building very complex products. And I would say, we're unique in that as we spoke at the beginning of the podcast, we have, really what are usually 3 different companies kind of under one roof. So it's a pretty complex integration process, which I think we've done a pretty good job of pulling it together. That's been a lot of the work. But I think in almost any area of healthcare, when you're working with your team, and especially as you scale, a lot of founders start and they may be the technical expert or it's, co-founders with a few technical folks. And, one of the things is as you scale, you get further and further away from being able to directly put your hands on the products, put your hands on the technology, and you have to build a company that scales. And what I can say is, communication about where the company's going, what the real critical endpoints are for patients. There's a reason we named our company Endpoint Health. It wasn't just to try and get a catchy name. It was as a purpose-built reminder for everyone, even when the founders aren't there or the execs aren't there, that if you're trying to make a technical decision, is it adding to the health of a patient? Can you directly point to why you're doing it or not? Those pieces that you can ingrain into how the company functions, I think, are critical for that long-term success. When you're small, you don't see it, but once you hit 10, 20, 50, 100 people, boy, they become present. And I think we've done a pretty good job there. I think, looking at failures, it's actually, I think we've done a pretty good job, but I'll say, when you don't focus on, a particular group of patients or a particular technology, that can be pretty difficult. I would say, even early on at our first company, we had a lot of different products that we could have looked at making, and it took a while to really focus down on 2, just focus on 2, one lead one that was relatively simple that could prove out a platform, and, one area of kind of advanced products where we're looking at guiding therapy use. And when I look back at the history of my first company, we could have made that choice in year 2, but to be honest, it was year 4. The company only existed independently for 5 years. So I always go and think, well, what would have happened, if we had, focused down and really looked a little bit earlier. It was a great success, but it all comes down to, does everyone know where they're going? And can you help everyone prioritize their work? And if you can do those 2 things, you can scale, you can help patients, you can spend money efficiently. I think those are 2 really critical areas. Yeah,
it's great advice. Great. I want to close maybe just on something forward-looking. What will Endpoint Health look like when you've sort of accomplished what you've set out to do? And what do you see as sort of the moment where you can stand and say, this is why we started? I mean, you've done such a good job of putting the Northstar right in the name, right? So
when my co-founders and I got together, we really did start out the company saying, we want to build the type of company that really is the next version of what top 10, top 20 pharma companies look like. And that wasn't about building a really big company that, had a large market cap. It was, really about, if we can take these changes in technology, if we can take, the ability to understand patients and turn that into practice with precision medicine development, if we can turn that into just the way that a company operates that develops new therapies, and we hit the same scale that your top 10 pharma companies are today, to me, what that means is we will have fundamentally driven a change in how healthcare is practiced, because so many things would have to be true were that to occur. It would mean that we had a sea of approved therapies out being used. And if we look at the patient populations we're looking at, those would be medical miracles. We're talking about areas like sepsis, or, as you move on to areas in the autoimmune illness, places where patients, even with the best therapies, might only have a 30, 40, 50% chance of responding. If we hit that scale, and maybe it's 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, for us, what that means is there's been a transformation. And what I think would also be true is it wouldn't just be Endpoint Health that was successful. That would mean our partners were successful. There would be other companies following along. And the beauty of that as a goal is not only are our patients that we treat better, but it means there's just a systemic change that would have to happen for us to reach that scale. And you've seen it. You could see it in other industries. I buy everything off of Amazon. They started with a bookstore. Any retail company could have said, I'm going to shut all my brick and mortar stores down and build an online presence. But it was Amazon that said, I'm going to build the future of retail. Tesla built a completely new car company. Everyone thought it was an electric car company, but in reality, they used the technology as a reason to build something that function differently than the current ecosystem. And I think I'm looking at the lineup of all the new electric cars. You drag an industry along with you. And I think for us, that's really our goal, is not just change the direct patients we serve, but be that example of what the future state should look like. Be the type of healthcare company that grandma really is proud of. That's a good litmus test, I think, for any healthcare company.
Jason Springs, Endpoint Health, thank you so much for joining me for this conversation. This is fascinating and again, great to see you guys doing this kind of work.
Raphael, thank you so much for the time. For anyone that wants to get more information, you can go to our website at endpointhealth.com. And thank you for listening.
This has been episode 27 of Talking Precision Medicine. Please share it with your colleagues, leave a comment or a review, and stay tuned for the next one. Thanks for joining the conversation.